Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I don't know why we moved into this hall, but alhamdulillah we'll do. We were competing with matrimonial, and hopefully that is the highest form of resistance. But inshallah we'll try to cover as much material as possible. What I wanted to really contextualize my talk in focusing on racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, and a call to action toward a new Muslim civil and human rights horizon. So in this sense, I will be focusing on the key concept of what we need to do and recognizing the issues and the problems that we are focusing on. But if I had an image projection, I would have begun by showing an image of Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge was the first girl, 6-year-old, to be admitted to a school in Louisiana to end segregation. And in November 14th, 1964, Ruby Bridges was escorted into the school at a time where the nation was trying to still deal with the legacies of racism, discrimination, and continued Jim Crow laws. Now, Ruby's father was actually hesitant to send her to school because it's a white-only school. He knows the type of challenges that were facing African Americans at the time. Lynching has been going on from the earliest period, but definitely was part and parcel of the civil rights movement. Her mother actually encouraged her and supported her to go to school. Initially, there were 6 kids that were admitted. Only Ruby ended up going. The other kids did not go. So she was the only kid that went. Her mother said, take this step forward for all African American children. And I'm using this phrase of taking the step for all African American children is to ask the question, where are the Muslims that are taking the steps forward, not only for Muslims, but also our larger society, and then also globally. Let me say one thing, that Muslims increasingly are preoccupied with identity and construction of identity. And I am, interested tangentially in that field, but you can't take on civil rights, human rights, globalization, while being preoccupied of how to be assimilated and integrated, or wanting to constantly be worried whether you're going to be invited into the White House or not, even though you're constantly on the menu. So in this sense, identity politics is an aspect, but it seems that Muslims have rewired themselves to only think of issues pertaining to assimilation and integration. It's important, but it's still, for me, it's a reductionist approach into challenging the structural aspect of our society. Ruby faced backlash, white backlash, which we are experiencing right now. Every time that Trump speaks, making America great again, we have to say that he's saying making America white again, but he doesn't say it. So he's actually still pushing on trying to reconstruct and imagine the America of the past. White parents at the time pulled all their children from school. All the teachers refused to teach this black kid, and only one teacher, Miss Barbara Held, that actually was teaching Ruby by herself as a full class, every day teaching her as the only class. Barbara Henry was teaching her as the only class. Every morning, as Bridges walked to school, one woman would threaten to poison her. Because of this, the U.S. Marshal dispatched by President Eisenhower were actually not allowing her to eat except the food that she brings from her home. So here, a 6-year-old having to face a woman yelling at her on a daily basis that she's going to poison her. Another woman at the school put a black baby doll in a wooden coffin and protested with it outside the windows of the school. Ruby said that doll scared me more than any nasty things that people screamed at us. So here, a 6-year-old girl having to face adults who are using a doll in a coffin in order to try to, once again, threaten and terrorize this little girl, and with it, African Americans. Her mother suggested to Bridget that she should pray on the way to school. And Ruby said that that was providing her comfort to constantly pray as she went along. I'm using this because as we engage in attempt to constitute and defend our civil and human rights, we think that we are alone or we are Johnny-come-lately, and meaning that we're not custodians and inheritors to a long history of resistance and attempt to actually win our civil and human rights. You see people today say that we have achieved a lot, especially those who are from the status quo mainstream. And you would think it's because of them that we have arrived. It is despite their resistance that we have arrived. Most of the civil rights gains, the Immigration Reform Act, the Voting Rights Act was won by people who were out on the streets, people who had to face dogs stuck at them, people that had to be fire hosed in order for them what? To be able to actually live what the Constitution provided them. So Muslims today, and I know we attempt to try to fit in, but we are citizens on probation. We are today citizens on probation. Our constitutional rights are not protected. And let me say where we are at today. Civil rights gain in the 1960s have been completely reversed. If you don't understand, I would recommend Sahar in here and Khalid. Both are great legal minds and also contribute to our work on Islamophobia. Ask them and they will definitely give you the full picture from the legal process and how it has completely distorted some of the civil rights gain in the 1960s. If you think the Patriot Act, we had in the 1960 Patriot Act, it was COINTELPRO. It was illegal then. Now COINTELPRO has become legalized, where all those elements that were gained in the civil rights have become codified into law. We have the rising right wing, and for those who look at history only from the 2008 election, I would actually say that the right wing in America began to try to have a counter response to the gains of the civil rights right immediately after the civil rights gains got in place and began to organize from the early 1970s. Their first victory was with the election of Reagan, who actually put in motion the deregulation programs in the country. He also brought about the Prison Reform Act in 1984. So today, as we think and we want to end the prison industrial complex, you have to trace it back to the 1984 Reform Act, and from that, that's the trajectory that we get in. We have pernicious capitalism, economic transformation, and we have constant intervention abroad. I am really shocked that Muslims don't critique our intervention abroad. Where is our critique of that post 9/11, the United States have opened so many bases and have increased its military footprint across the globe? I actually wrote a piece on that. While we celebrate Obama as a president that comes from people of color, he have increased drones, use of drones as an instrument of warfare. And for each terrorist that they supposedly have killed, there are about 50 civilians that have been killed through drone strikes. And therefore, we have become clinical in the attempt or in the use of military intervention. And I know there's many calls for trying to fit in, but fitting in while being part of the machinery is not fitting in, is accepting and consenting to that which is injustice. Now, I have a strong position and strong engagement with Palestine, but I know Muslims post 9/11, up even to the current, that they want to talk about everything except Palestine because it's threatened their attempt to integrate and assimilate. So integration by leaving Palestine on the door has become almost a norm. Now shifting a little bit is that we have a massive economic inequality. Massive economic inequality. And I think Trump is stoking fear, stoking white resentment, but he's actually targeting the wrong group. 62 individuals have more wealth than 3.5 billion people. Let me repeat it. 62 individuals have more wealth than 3.5 billion people, which basically the two rows, these three rows together, this group have more wealth than 3.5 billion people. Last year there were actually 82, so you could see those who were left out are feeling bad. Right? Like I was part of the country club, and now I'm on the out. I only have 20 billion. Right? So 62 individuals essentially have more wealth than 3.5 billion people. The haves have some more, and the have-nots have nothing at all except their commodified bodies. And that's basically most of the southern hemisphere right now is in a commodified bodies in there. Yesterday, one person says that we're living in a great country. I said, yes, but realize that we're actually living on top of much of the world because we consume about 65% of the renewable resources of the world to keep our standard of living. And part of being conscious is to realize this, not to create a suspense that you're unable to act, but actually to realize that you have a very heavy carbon footprint that you have on the rest of the world. And you cannot be a conscious Muslim. You cannot be a conscious Muslim without taking into this account. What is the purpose if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says or command you to justice? Right? إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ. God commands to justice. What is the meaning of commanding to justice if we ourselves, at least at minimum, consciously situate ourselves and our consciousness in this sense? Now, more broadly, we have to also articulate that we are living in a world today that is heavily militarized. The United States, the country that we enjoy, have 54% of the world market in armament. So often when somebody says, why don't the Muslims stop the violence? I say, I agree with you 100%, stop selling us weapons. You cannot sell machines, death economy, at the same time blame those who are engaged in violence at the plantation, while those who are benefiting economically from the massive military-industrial complex are sitting there without being taken into account. And the largest country that sells, manufactures, and produces arms is the United States, followed by Britain, followed by Russia, and followed by the Burkini band, which is France, also sits in fourth place. And then the Trans-European Union is in fifth, and then Italy, and so on. Meaning that if you are speaking from a principle on violence, you can't provide guns to the individuals in the areas around the world and often selling both sides while blaming them for engaging in the violence. It's similar today here in Chicago. Those individuals who actually point to African American crime while at the same time continue to defend the Second Amendment with an M50 because you're going to go hunting for ducks with an M50. There's a contradictions in there. You can't blame the plantation level violence while you're engaged in sophisticated economic production relative to machines and production of violence. So we have to critique this. Now let me shift in terms of the fear that is being presented for us today. Terrorism is attempting to create fear, and that fear that is to be mobilized and monetized into vote at the ballot box. That's the strategy. It's much easier to rally people out of fear rather than from hope. We see it in many parts of Europe. Fear has been very strongly monetized in the Brexit. It's strongly being monetized right now in the French context and their upcoming election. It's been monetized in Austria, monetized in Netherlands, and now we're seeing in the Republican side, it has been monetized in the 2010 election, midterm election, and it's being pushed heavily at this point with the Trump election. So we need to understand how this fear is presented and focusing and problematizing the Muslim subject. The Muslim subject in American and Western discourse is problematized. Nothing about our life is normal. For example, individuals say, well, I want to speak to you and I say that I am human like you. Saying that statement, you're accepting your subhumanness. No one should stand in there and say, I'm human like you, because that is accepting the assumption that you are in a status of subhumanness. And if you go into some of the race theories and how race functions in a very sophisticated way, we should not in any time or any discourse trying to rationalize our humanity. Your humanity and your dignity is given by God. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. You don't need at any given time to actually try to assert your humanness, because that is assuming and taking as a point of departure your subhumanness. And that's how sophisticated aspect of mindset. And I know that we're celebrating Muhammad Ali. If anything, if you take Muhammad Ali, right, and look at, he never tried to asserted his humanness. He asserted his dignity and the ability to be who he is with all the complexity as a human being. So we need to understand that as far as our dynamic. Now, if I had a slide in here, I'll show you the terrorism statistics from 1980 to 2014. Muslims actually, in relations to the statistics, only are assumed to have committed 4% of terrorist activity from 1980 to 2014. 4%. Similarly, if you study the European Union, across the European Union, terrorist activity from 1980 to 2014 by the Interpol, only 4% of these terrorism cases actually are attributed to Muslims. Puerto Ricans, not that I want to pick on my Puerto Rican brothers, but they were given 26% of the terrorist activities in the US. Environmentalists have 11%. Animal welfare groups, 9%. Armenian groups actually committed 5%. Jewish community or Jewish terrorism in the US are 7%. But if you turn on the news, the only terrorism that you see is the Muslim terrorism, once again, because it's been picked as a subject to monetize it into votes and to influence the political discourse. And same thing in Europe, and those images are available. Now, another part of this is since 9/11 till now, the total number of deaths in the United States as a result of terrorism, including 9/11, are 3,402 deaths as a result of terrorism. On a yearly basis in the United States, there are 32,000 individuals that are killed as a result of either mass violence, where 3 individuals or more are killed, or being killed on a regular basis in this country. So 32,000 annually versus 3,402 individuals as a result of all the terrorism from 9/11 till now. But again, the focus and the attention is completely separate. So, I said racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Islamophobia has to be understood as white supremacy, new expanded lease on life. That's what Islamophobia is. Islamophobia is white supremacy's new expanded lease on life. And it's also a structural reorganization of the state resources and the society responses to internal empowerment as well as external empowerment of groups and communities around the globe. This gets me to critique Muslim approach to Islamophobia. Be patient with me. Muslim approach to Islamophobia has been the following. An Islamophobe hits us in the face and we go out to get a plastic surgery because we assume that our face is not beautiful. Right? An Islamophobe hits us in the face and we go out to get a plastic surgery, and if we can't afford plastic surgery, we get Fair and Lovely to bleach our face. Meaning, we don't understand the structural racist infrastructure that is operation. And mind you, I'm not telling you not to go and give the 5 pillars of faith and to show that Muslims, are nice people. You're nice. You don't need to make yourself nice, right? All these operations internalize that there's something wrong in you. So we need to shift to understand that to challenge Islamophobia, you have to challenge the structural components that make Islamophobia possible. One philosopher said that society produces the crime and the criminal goes out and commission it. And I would say society, and in here the elite power produces Islamophobia, and then the walking Islamophobe goes and articulated in civil society. We focus our attention only on the walking Islamophobe, but not on the structural aspect that produces Islamophobia. So we need to be aware how these structures operate and begins to challenge it in a systematic way. Now I know I have a few more minutes to speak about this, but for us, we have to be aware that there has to be a structural response. When I said that we need to have a civil and human rights, it has to be a civil and human rights, and I make those 2 components important. Civil rights is domestic, human rights is transnational. We cannot be a Muslim where we only think that only we want to improve our neighborhood, and then at the same time accept to go out on missions abroad to tell how good is our life as Muslims. There's a contradiction in there. As a person, as a human, quote unquote, you have the right to express yourself on domestic and transnational issue. I see people walking with Malcolm X, but also they're not articulating what Malcolm X was domestic and transnational simultaneously, civil and human rights. Martin Luther King began with civil rights, but in 1967 he actually arrived into transnationality. That's why you need to go, not I have a dream, but actually go to 1967 where actually Martin Luther King took on the Vietnam War, right? And he gave two speeches that are very critical, right? When he gave his speech, silence is complicity, and then followed by the speech, the three evils of society. Don't get, a lot of people cite I have a dream because they don't want to wake up. I want you to read I have a dream, but go up and also read the three evils of society. As a Muslim today, you have the responsibility to read that speech, understand the arguments that Martin Luther King made at that time, because we are exactly at the same place. He said we are facing three evils. The evils of racism, the evils of materialism, and the evils of militarism. Look, today, we are facing the same three evils that have not shifted. Islamophobia, anti-black violence, anti-black racism, anti-Latinos, anti-Asian rhetoric in relation to the problem or the fault that China is causing us to lose our economic competitiveness, is the same type of the three evils of society. Go and listen to his speech. Take the time, download it. Read the text time and time again, because I think it's one of the masterful speeches to have been given by Martin Luther King, and 6 months after he was killed. Right? So he arrived at transnationality. So civil rights domestic, transnational in terms of the global perspective. So in order for us to be rooted in our consciousness, we have to do this in relation to follow whether it's in the footsteps of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, or any of the major civil rights movement individuals. Adding to this, that in order to take on those issues, it's a hard path. It's a hard path. So you might not be invited to a lot of different gatherings. You might not be in company of the, not to say the VIPs, right? Because you're taking and challenging the basic assumption of the US government and the basic assumption of what I consider to be the cluster of the global North power. That does not mean that we don't have our own contradictions. We do, and we should work on them simultaneously in order for us to challenge the civil and human rights perspective. Now I'm going to just go through this. These are just images with statements, and I wish that we had the projection, but I say Muslims are unequal citizens at every meaning of that word. I know that we have many cases of banks shutting Muslim bank accounts without any evidence or any case whatsoever, and there was a challenge to this. So in this sense that we are on probation constantly. We also have to say something about the domestic CVE, countering violent extremism. We are the only group that is treated with the CVE program, which means as a class, Muslims as a class are being dealt with from the countering violent extremism. But to flip this, I actually say we should have countering violent economics. Taking the terms and flip it on side. Countering violent economics. 12.5 million Americans were thrown out of their homes, yet only one banker ended up in jail. More so, they stole our money collectively, and then we gave them $776 billion in rescue package. We should have a countering violent economics in relation to our society. They have wreaked havoc in much of the southern hemisphere in relation to this pernicious economics. We should have countering violent economics. So taking the terms that are applied, so instead of our mosque being a place where you actually could have spiritual grounding, you're actually going to be engaged in trying to monitor who's going to be the radical. If there is an assumption of trying to monitor radicals, how come we don't have a CVE on the KKK, where their numbers actually, even on Facebook, they have 25,000 followers? African Americans have a legitimate reason to actually call for countering violent extremism on the KKK, considering between 1876 and 1950, KKK was responsible for 4,000 lynching in only 12 states. Right? So these are the facts, and we are constantly being assumed that we need to respond and act in ways that is contrary to basic assumption of what a human being needs to undertake. Now, what do I want you to do? Once again, make information accessible, sound information. Do your research. Share the information and get it out. Expose and challenge those who produce and promote hate, racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. It's just you cannot be a Muslim without challenging that basic epistemic that is seeping at the foundation of our society. And I'm not only saying for Muslims who are only just us. I want to see Muslims out challenging racism toward African Americans. I want to see students, you are MSA, go to your campuses and tell them to stop investing in the prison industrial complex. Our UC system, the University of California, the highest system in the country, was investing in the prison industrial complex, meaning our retirement was invested in funds that produce returns from having prisons. If there is a foundational wrong, like it just should hit you in your stomach that a university is invested in prisons. That should be a mission for us, that to actually shut down the doors that actually access these prisons and open these prisons for many individuals that are racialized into permanent state of imprisonment because it generates revenues and funds across. So you need to go back and make those challenges at the localized level. So you can't think of the prison system in there and not to think of it as part and parcel of your own life. Develop coalitions that challenge racism across the board, that challenge militarism across the board, challenges intervention across the board. So I am committed to defending Muslims, but I want you likewise to realize that all of the other communities are at the same spot. From 9/11 till now, about 2.8 million Latinos have been deported under the assumption of the war on terrorism. 2.8 million. Because if you remember, Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilization was followed by a book that says the challenge for America is from the Latino population. When he said who we are, he said we are an Anglo-Saxon settler society and the Latino constitute a threat to American society. So you cannot engage in defending against Islamophobia without recognizing that making America strong again wants to remove as many Latinos from this society as possible in order to have the Lily 1950 America of somebody's imagination. So you have to create those coalitions. They have to be serious, they have to be grounded, they have to be sincere, and they have to be ready to actually engage in sacrifices in working on these coalitions. Become more active in all areas of civil society. Become more active in all areas of civil society. Let me critique Muslims again, because I'm with you. We only show up once every 4 years to try to see whether it's the donkey or the elephant that's going to actually win our vote. That's basically, we reduce our politics to possibly one day every 4 years, and then we complain because after the election we go back into what you call the I have a dream, right, state, and we come back 4 years after. Political engagement in civil society is 24/7. And it has to be a commitment that we do. That's basically, for me, that's what it requires, 24/7. It requires going to the library and taking some of the garbage books that are there that is tarnishing Muslims, that are tarnishing African Americans, speaking ill of Native Americans and so on, that you have to be that active. You need to go to the Board of Education schools. Also run for office. The only thing you could do is you lose, but at least you put all your ideas forward. That's the time for you to go out to engage in civil society. I want you to actually write a blog, develop sources of information on the internet, write narrative and put your information. If you don't, somebody else writes about you and then you complain about it. At least if you write, they have to complain about what you write. And in this, you get more clicks and likes on Twitter and so on. So write. And the technology is so easy, you could just get a blog almost overnight. Don't worry about what you call editing and so on. There's many people that you actually could use for editing in a very short period of time. But put the material out there. What the Islamophobes do, they all put their garbage in there and they cross-reference each other. So all of a sudden you search any Muslim leader in this country or in Europe, you'll all get all of the Islamophobic entry because they cross-examine each other. For us as Muslims, right? If you don't agree with me 99.999%, I'm not gonna cite you. You have to agree with me with 999.999% for me to cite you. And if that doesn't happen, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Right? Our opposition, they don't agree on anything often, but they cite each other because they know their common enemy. The Islamophobia. If you think of Islamophobia, if you think that Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, David Horowitz, Stephen Emerson, Douglas Feith, and all of this 74 Islamophobic group, they agree, you're just deluded. But they know that all share the same comment that these are Muslims, that they need to be deported. They cite each other ad nauseum. For us, we don't do likes or like. We read the whole article, we see a line that we disagree with. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله, it's kufr. Even though it has nothing to do with Sharia, theology, or anything, it's just basic political. Right? We have to understand how to work together and to create a framework to defend our community as a collective. And that is a fundamental for us. So write and so on in order for us to be effective. Lastly, donate to institutions and individuals to support the work and for us to be very effective, inshallah. I am very confident that we could make a difference, but we need a mental change of mind of what it is that we're actually trying to fight and resist. Lastly, the term resistance, right, have the same root of qama, to stand up. You can't resist if you're staying asleep. Silence does not change history. Staying asleep does not change history. Only speaking people make history. I'm not asking you not to meditate, but stand up and defend your rights and defend the rights of what we consider to be a just society it needs to be. And I think it is within our capacity to do so because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.